Okay, uh, when I started doing the programs on the Seminole War books, I had one that was on generally both the war overall, and I said I'd have a second one. Now this is part two, although I had some sidetracks in between, books on the forts and biographies and eyewitness accounts. So these are books that cover the overall war. The first one I have to show is America's Hundred-Year War, an expansion to the Gulf Coast and the fate of the Seminoles, 1763 to 1858, covering roughly 100 years, edited by William Belko. And this is it. Uh, it's a series of essays, and I pretty much knew most of the authors who wrote these. Look in the context, of course, as James Cusick, uh, David and Jeanne Heidler, Joe Knish, Sam Watson, Jim Denham, Brian Rucker. I have articles and books from most of those people, so it wasn't too much anything new to me, but I really enjoyed the essays or articles that they have in the book. It's a bit pricey. It's by University Press of Florida. I guess that answers why that is. The next book is by Chris Monaco, who is from Gainesville, The Second Seminole War and the Limits of Aggression. He put some of his blog or postings or his articles in the book, and that's actually very good. I like it when somebody comes up with something different and thinks of what we thought of in the past and in a different way of thinking. He has a chapter on the Seminoles and Maroons, chapter on the uh, Osceola as settler colonial icon, on the different views of Osceola, and has a uh, chapter on bloodhounds, abolitionists, and freedom fighters. And he also has a chapter here on malaria and its effect in the war. And I really enjoy his spin on some of the things. I don't agree with everything he says, but I think that's a good way of thinking for yourself and coming up with your own conclusions. But his Osceola chapter is one I've raved about before, and now it's in book form. This next book, I'm not sure if it's still in print. I know he sold the last copies that he had, the author Joe Knish, good friend of mine. Fear and Anxiety on the Florida Frontier, Articles on the Second Seminole War, with another Jackson Walker painting of Osceola going through St. Augustine. This is also a series of essays or articles. Joe took some of his best articles, like on Micanopy, the town of Micanopy, Cantonment Morgan, that's at Cedar Key, has William Jenkins Worth and the colonialization of Florida. That's about the Armed Occupation Act and outbreak of in the Florida Keys in 1836, Charlotte Harbor, a brief moment of fame in the whirlwind of war at Fort Drane, airy and comfortable life in forts in Fort Brooke to Fort Milne Road. He can write good on just about anything he does. One of the books I have that he wrote about the Cold War. He's just finished another book on Florida during World War One, and so he goes all over history. This one's been around a while. Men at Arms series, America Indians in the Southeast, and this, people do miniatures and of different war and conflicts, and these Men at Arms series books are made mainly for doing that. Just give some good illustrations of the Southeast Native Americans. And there's another one, Men at Arms series, Osprey Publishers, The Seminole Wars, 1818 to 1858. And also some very good color plates of the Seminoles and the militia and the soldiers. Yeah, here's one of the Seminoles in the back. Well, shows one wearing a derby, but the derbies weren't, I don't know if they were really in Florida in the Third Seminole War yet. They're more late 1800s. This book I bought from the person online. I think he was an Army chaplain, Kenneth Lawson, Religion and the U.S. Army Chaplaincy in the Florida Seminole War. So that was interesting. That's on the book. I think that might be Guy Labrie. I'm not sure. On back painting is a painting in Paynes Creek, but he gives the religious movements in the Seminole War very interesting description on that. I disagree with what he says about the Seminole beliefs. I hate to call them religious beliefs, cultural beliefs. He rather simplifies it. The square ground philosophy and beliefs, I think, are way more complicated than he describes it here. He kind of turns into animism. But the one thing I like is he talks about the Great Awakening and how it was affecting the country during the war. And you had a conflict in the Seminole War. You had people who were real religious and heavily into the temperance movement, were against drinking. And then other times you had places in Florida that were just hedonistic and people who wanted no religion whatsoever. So I think it really does a good job on describing that. This book, John and Mary Lou Missall, we're going through all the antique newspapers, This Torn Land, and it's poetry of the Second Seminole War. And they got some poetry from the Army Navy Chronicles and the newspapers. So it's interesting. It kind of gives you a view of life during the Seminole War, written from people who published their poetry in years past when people were more into doing that. This and John and Mary Lou, talking about them, they completed another novel, Hollow Victory, a novel of the Second Seminole War, and so that's and it's a pretty good long novel. It's not quite as long as the Elizabeth's War on the First Seminole War, but very comprehensive. They're working on another book that's not out, which will be a novel on the Second Seminole War, which I believe they're working with one of the tribal members. They're going to cover all First, Second, and Third Seminole War and the life of the Seminole that lived through it. And this last book is one that I found recently, and so I had to get a copy in one of the booksellers. It's a children's book, Rebellions, Revolts, Uprisings, the Seminole War, or the Seminole Wars, Ellis Roxburgh. I think it's published in New York. It's a children's book or juvenile youth, but it just has some outstanding artwork and photos and paintings in here. Look, all the pages look like burning parchment. And so, I mean, it simplifies things, but it's good for a children's book. And I'll have that in the description down below as well. So that's all I have for today. Now, the next time I'll be talking about the Black Seminoles, and there are many books written on them, and I will just show you a few. I hope you enjoyed this video, and goodbye for now.